At 11:16 p.m., 40 meters from a disabled vehicle, he made a decision that violated every rule of survival. The vehicle was destroyed, intentionally, by his own unit. If he stayed near it, he would be found within hours. If he moved away, he had no chance of escape. What he didn't know yet was that the enemy had already assumed the vehicle would never move again, and that assumption would become the only reason he survived. The year is 1943. The war has turned every road, every forest, every river into contested ground. He is a mechanic, 26 years old, assigned to a small unit operating behind enemy lines. Not because he volunteered, because someone had to go. His job was simple: keep the vehicles running, keep the unit mobile. But mobility had just been eliminated, on purpose. The vehicle had been sabotaged, fuel lines cut, engine block cracked with a sledgehammer, axles bent beyond function. Standard protocol. If you can't take it with you, make sure the enemy can't use it either. The unit retreated on foot. He stayed behind to confirm the destruction was complete. That confirmation took 4 minutes. By the time he finished, the unit was already gone, and enemy patrols were converging on the area faster than expected. The vehicle sat in a shallow depression, partially hidden by trees, still warm. Enemy search teams were operating under a clear assumption. Anyone left behind would flee. Distance equals survival. Staying near a destroyed asset made no tactical sense, so they wouldn't waste time searching the immediate area. They would push outward, close the perimeter, wait for movement. He understood this. He also understood something else. He had no map, no radio, no extraction point. The nearest friendly position was at least 3 days away on foot, through occupied territory, with active patrols. Running meant exposure. Exposure meant capture. But staying near the vehicle meant being found when they eventually returned to salvage parts or verify the destruction. Every option led to the same outcome, except one. He looked at the vehicle again. Fuel lines cut, engine cracked, axles bent. Destroyed. Officially. But destruction is a spectrum. The enemy would see a vehicle that couldn't move. They would assume it would never move. They would be wrong, because the engine wasn't the only way to generate motion. The fuel lines weren't the only way to deliver power. And bent didn't mean broken. He opened the toolkit, strapped beneath the driver's seat. Still there. Standard issue. Wrenches, pliers, wire, a small pry bar. Not enough to rebuild, but enough to improvise. The problem wasn't whether he could make it move. The problem was whether he could do it silently, invisibly, before they came back. He had no idea how much time he had. But he knew one thing. If the enemy found the vehicle in the same condition they expected, they would ignore it. If they found it altered, even slightly, they would know someone was still nearby. So the work had to be invisible. No noise, no light, no evidence. He pulled the toolkit closer. The sledgehammer had cracked the engine block, but it hadn't shattered it completely. Coolant was leaking. Oil was seeping into the dirt. The engine wouldn't run, not conventionally, but the vehicle had a manual transmission, a clutch, a drive shaft. If he could disconnect the engine entirely and find another way to generate rotational force, the wheels would still turn. Gravity wouldn't work. The terrain was too flat. Manual pushing wouldn't work. Too slow, too exposed. But the vehicle had something else, a hand crank starter. Most crews had removed them months ago. Dead weight. Unnecessary. His unit hadn't. The crank was still mounted beneath the front chassis, designed to start the engine manually in cold conditions. It connected directly to the crankshaft. If he bypassed the engine and rerouted the connection to the transmission, the crank could theoretically rotate the driveshaft. Not efficiently, not fast, but it would move. He crawled underneath. The ground was cold, damp. He worked by touch. The crankshaft connection was accessible. Barely. He loosened the primary bolt with a wrench. Slowly, stopping every few seconds to listen. Voices in the distance, getting closer. He froze. The voices passed. Moved south. He kept working. The connection came free. He set it aside carefully. No noise. Now the transmission. The input shaft was exposed once he removed the clutch housing. Standard design. He'd rebuilt this model twice before, but never in the dark, never in silence, never with the enemy 60 meters away. He rerouted the crank connection to the input shaft using a section of spare chain from the toolkit. It wasn't designed for this. The tension was wrong. The angle was wrong. But it held. He tested it. One slow rotation. The drive shaft turned. The wheels moved. 3 centimeters. It worked. But it was loud. The chain rattled. The gears ground. Metal on metal. Unacceptable. He packed the connection points with mud, dirt, anything to dampen the sound. Tested again. Quieter. Not silent, but quieter. He crawled out from underneath. The fuel tank was still half full. Useless now, but the weight was a problem. He drained it. Slowly. Let the fuel soak into the ground far from the vehicle. Lighter meant easier to move. He removed the seats, the spare tire, the ammunition boxes, everything non-essential. The vehicle was now a frame. Wheels, transmission, crank. Nothing else. He looked at the trees. The depression the vehicle sat in sloped gently to the east, barely perceptible, but enough. If he could get the vehicle moving even slightly, gravity would help. Not much, but enough. The enemy returned at dawn. He heard them before he saw them. 3 men, maybe 4. They approached the vehicle from the west. Voices low, methodical. He was 30 meters away, hidden in the underbrush, motionless. They inspected the vehicle, checked the engine, confirmed the damage. One of them kicked the front tire, laughed. They moved on. They didn't look underneath. They didn't check the crank. They saw what they expected to see, a destroyed vehicle, useless. He waited until they were gone. Then he waited longer. 2 hours. Silence. He moved back to the vehicle. The hand crank was still in place, the connection intact. He positioned himself at the front, gripped the crank. 1 rotation. The wheels turned. The vehicle moved 5 centimeters. He rotated again, 10 centimeters. Again, 15. The slope was helping, barely, but it was enough. He kept cranking, slowly, stopping every few rotations to listen. No voices, no movement, just the sound of his own breathing and the faint creak of metal turning in silence. Every manual on escape and evasion said the same thing. Distance first, speed second, stealth third. Put as much ground between yourself and the enemy as quickly as possible. Worry about being quiet later. He was doing the opposite. 0 distance, 0 speed, maximum exposure. He was staying at the exact location the enemy had already searched, moving a destroyed vehicle that wasn't supposed to move, using a method that would take hours to cover the distance a man could walk in minutes. It made no sense, but Sense assumed the enemy would search the same place twice. They wouldn't. They had already confirmed the vehicle was inoperable, already moved their search pattern outward, already committed resources to closing the perimeter 2 kilometers away. They were looking for someone running, not someone rebuilding. He cranked again. The vehicle rolled forward, 30 centimeters this time. The slope was increasing, slight but measurable. He could feel it in the resistance. The crank turned easier now. Gravity was beginning to do part of the work, but the noise was still a problem. Every rotation produced a low grinding sound, metal on metal, dampened by the mud he'd packed into the connection points, but not eliminated. In daylight, it would be heard from 50 meters away. At night, farther. He stopped cranking, but listened. Nothing. He cranked again, 5 rotations, then stopped. Listened. Still nothing. The pattern repeated. Crank. Stop. Listen. Crank. Stop. Listen. Progress was measured in centimeters, then meters. Time became irrelevant. He didn't know if it had been 1 hour or 3. The sky was still dark. That was all that mattered. The vehicle reached the edge of the depression. The slope increased. He repositioned himself, tested the crank. 1 rotation moved the vehicle half a meter now. Gravity was taking over, but control was slipping. If the vehicle rolled too fast, it would crash, make noise, draw attention. He needed to slow it down without stopping it completely. He moved to the rear, found a section of broken axle he'd removed earlier, wedged it against the rear wheel, a makeshift brake. He returned to the crank, rotated carefully. The vehicle moved forward. The brake dragged, slowed the roll. It worked. He kept going. The forest thickened ahead, trees closer together, underbrush denser. Good for concealment, bad for maneuvering. The vehicle was too wide to fit between some of the trees. He adjusted course, cranked at an angle, let the vehicle drift slightly left. The front wheel caught on a root, stopped. He pulled the pry bar from the toolkit, wedged it under the wheel, levered it free. The vehicle rolled forward again, slower now. The terrain was fighting him. Every meter required more effort, more time, more noise. But the enemy search pattern was moving away. He could hear them in the distance, voices, orders, boots on dirt, south and west, away from him. They were following doctrine. Expand the perimeter, close the gaps, wait for movement. They had no reason to believe anyone would still be at the origin point. He cranked again. The vehicle cleared the tree line, entered a narrow ravine. The walls were steep, rocky, covered in loose stones. Bad terrain for a vehicle, worse terrain for a man on foot. But the ravine ran east, toward friendly territory. He kept cranking. The wheels slipped on the loose stones, lost traction. The vehicle slid sideways. He braced himself against the rear, pushed. The vehicle straightened. He cranked again. Progress slowed to a crawl, but it was still progress. The ravine curved north, then east again. He followed it. The sky began to lighten. Dawn. He had maybe 30 minutes before full daylight. After that, movement would be impossible. He cranked faster. The vehicle picked up speed, too much speed. The brake caught, held, then snapped. The vehicle rolled forward uncontrolled. 10 meters, 20. It hit a boulder. Stopped hard. The impact echoed through the ravine. He dropped to the ground, motionless, waited. Voices in the distance. Closer now. Someone had heard. He stayed flat against the ground. The voices grew louder. 2 men, maybe 3. They were moving toward the ravine, not running, walking. Curious, not alarmed. He crawled underneath the vehicle, wedged himself between the frame and the rocks. The voices reached the top of the ravine, stopped. Silence, then boots on stone, descending. They were coming down. He controlled his breathing, shallow, silent. The boots stopped 3 meters away. He could see them through the gap between the vehicle and the ground. 2 men, one of them kicked a loose stone. It clattered down the ravine. They spoke, low voices, a language he didn't understand. One of them walked around the vehicle, slowly, stopped at the front. He could see the man's boots, worn leather, mud-caked. The man crouched, looked underneath. He froze. The man's face appeared. Inches away, eye contact. For 1 full second, neither of them moved. Then the man stood, turned, walked back to his partner, spoke again. The partner responded. They both walked away, up the ravine, back toward the tree line. Gone? He didn't move, not yet. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. No sound. He crawled out. The man had seen him, directly, and walked away. Why? He replayed the moment in his mind. The man's face, the expression. Not surprise, not alarm, something else, confusion. The man had expected to see someone running, hiding in the forest, moving away. Not someone underneath a destroyed vehicle that wasn't supposed to be there. The context didn't match the expectation. So the man's brain had rejected it, assumed he was seeing something else. A shadow, a trick of the light, cognitive dissonance. He exhaled, moved back to the crank. The vehicle was wedged against the boulder. He needed to reverse it slightly, change the angle, but the crank only worked in one direction, forward. He grabbed the pry bar, wedged it between the boulder and the front wheel, levered. The vehicle shifted. Centimeters. He levered again. The wheel cleared the boulder. He repositioned at the crank, rotated. The vehicle rolled forward, away from the boulder, back into the center of the ravine. The slope here was steeper. He didn't need to crank as much. Gravity did most of the work, but control was harder. He let the vehicle roll, walked alongside it, one hand on the frame. When it moved too fast, he dragged his boots, created friction, slowed it down. The ravine widened ahead, opened into a dried riverbed. Flat terrain, he'd have to crank again. He repositioned, gripped the crank, rotated. The vehicle moved. Slower now. The mud he'd packed into the connection points had dried, cracked, fallen away. The grinding noise was back, louder than before. He stopped, looked for more mud. The riverbed was dry, no water, no soft dirt, only sand and stone. He kept cranking anyway. The noise didn't matter anymore. The search pattern had moved too far away. The enemy wouldn't hear, and if they did, they'd assume it was something else, a falling branch, an animal, anything but a destroyed vehicle moving on its own. He cranked for another hour, maybe 2. The sun rose fully now, exposed, but the riverbed offered no cover anyway. He kept moving. The vehicle crossed into a section of the riverbed scattered with debris, old equipment, rusted metal, shell casings, a previous battle, weeks ago, maybe months. He stopped, scanned the debris, found a section of track from a destroyed tank, heavy, curved. He dragged it to the vehicle, positioned it beneath the rear wheels, a ramp. He cranked. The vehicle climbed the track, gained elevation, rolled faster when it came down the other side. Momentum. He used it. Found another piece of debris, another ramp, repeated the process. Each ramp added speed, reduced the amount of cranking required. He chained them together, one after another. The vehicle moved faster now, not fast by any standard, but faster than before. The riverbed curved east, then northeast. He followed it. The terrain began to rise. Gentle incline. The vehicle slowed. He cranked harder. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His hands cramped. Blisters formed, burst, bled. He kept cranking. The incline steepened. The vehicle stopped. He cranked harder. It didn't move. Gravity was working against him now. He repositioned, braced his legs, put his full weight into the crank. 1 rotation. The vehicle moved. 5 centimeters. He rotated again. 10 centimeters. Again, 15. The incline peaked, leveled out. He stopped, caught his breath. Ahead, the riverbed opened into a valley, and beyond the valley, a ridge. Friendly territory? Maybe. He couldn't be sure, but it was the right direction. He cranked again. The enemy patrol returned to the original site 6 hours after dawn, not to search, to salvage. Standard procedure. Destroyed vehicles still had parts worth recovering, wheels, axles, metal plating. They expected to find the vehicle exactly where they'd left it. They didn't. The first man to notice radioed immediately. The response was confusion, not alarm. Confusion. A vehicle doesn't move on its own. Someone had taken it, but who? No tracks, no signs of towing, no evidence of a recovery team, just absence. The patrol expanded their search, followed the depression eastward, found drag marks, faint, inconsistent. Not from tires, from something else. They followed the marks into the forest, lost them in the underbrush, picked them up again in the ravine, followed the ravine to the riverbed, found the debris, the improvised ramps. And then they understood, not recovered, rebuilt. The realization changed everything. Someone with technical knowledge had stayed behind, hidden, worked in silence, and escaped using a vehicle that was supposed to be inoperable. They radioed again. This time, the response was immediate. Redirect all search teams, focus east, assume the target is mobile. But the orders came too late. By the time the new search pattern was deployed, he was already out of range. The vehicle rolled into the valley at 4:32 p.m. He stopped cranking, listened. No voices, no engines, no movement, just wind. He scanned the ridge ahead, no enemy positions visible, but that didn't mean they weren't there. He repositioned at the crank, rotated slowly. The vehicle moved toward the ridge. The incline was gradual, manageable. He cranked steadily, didn't stop. The ridge grew closer, 200 meters, 100, 50. He reached the base, stopped, looked up. The ridge was steeper than it appeared from a distance, too steep for the vehicle. He'd have to leave it. He grabbed the toolkit, slung it over his shoulder, started climbing. The ridge was loose rock, unstable. Every step dislodged stones, sent them tumbling. He climbed carefully. Halfway up he stopped, looked back. The vehicle sat at the base, motionless. It had carried him 15 kilometers, maybe more, far enough. He kept climbing, reached the top, looked east, a valley, a road, and in the distance, movement, vehicles, friendly markings. He'd made it. He descended the ridge, slowly, reached the road at dusk. The convoy stopped when they saw him. 3 men exited, weapons raised. He raised his hands, identified himself. They lowered their weapons, asked how he'd gotten there. He told them. They didn't believe him. Not at first, but when they went back to verify, they found the vehicle, still sitting at the base of the ridge, stripped, modified, barely recognizable, but functional. They brought it back, studied it, documented it, filed a report. The report noted the use of improvised engineering under extreme conditions. It did not note the man who'd done it, only the method. After the war, he returned to working on vehicles, not military, civilian. He never spoke about what he'd done, not because it was classified, but because no one asked. Survival didn't require heroics. It required understanding that the enemy's assumptions were as much a weapon as their patrols, and that sometimes the last place they'd look was the place you'd never left. This account is based on documented incidents of field improvisation and enemy search doctrine during World War II. Specific details have been adapted to protect operational security, but the core method, rebuilding instead of running, occurred multiple times across multiple theaters. The assumption that destroyed means useless has always been the first thing worth destroying.